Japan lost the most important naval battle of the Pacific War before a single plane left the deck, because the enemy had already read the plan. The fleet that sailed toward a small atoll in the Central Pacific in the summer of 1942 believed it was setting a trap. It was sailing into one. The other side knew roughly where it was going, roughly when, and roughly in what strength. Because for months, its radio intelligence had been reading the fleet's most secret operational cipher. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough to rebuild the shape of the coming attack from the coded messages the fleet itself was sending. In the last episode, we followed an engineer who built the finest fighter of the early war and judged it the wrong weapon. We opened this one with something stranger and more damaging than any single machine. The Navy's most secret code, the cipher the Navy believed was unbreakable, being quietly read by the men it was meant to keep out. This is the story of how that happened, and of the part that is hardest to accept. The Imperial Navy was warned, more than once, in more than one way. There were signs that the enemy's reactions were too fast, too precise, too lucky to be luck. The officers who saw those signs raised the question, and the Navy, by most accounts, chose not to believe it. Who warned them, and why they refused? That is what we end on.
To understand the failure, you first have to understand the thing that failed. A naval code in this era was not a single secret key. The fleet's main operational cipher was built from a large codebook, a thick volume in which thousands of words, places, ships, and phrases were each replaced by a group of numbers. A message was first turned into those code groups, and then, to make it harder to break, each group was disguised a second time by adding another set of numbers drawn from a separate book of additives. 2 layers, a codebook to hide the meaning and an additive to hide the codebook. To read a message, an outsider would have to strip away the additive he was not supposed to have and then reconstruct a codebook he had never seen. It sounds, described that way, very nearly hopeless to break, and that was exactly the Navy's confidence. The system was complex, it was changed periodically, and it protected the most sensitive traffic in the fleet. To the men who used it, the idea that an enemy could read it was not so much rejected as never seriously entertained. But complexity is not the same as security. A code of this kind can be worn down. Every message sent in it is a clue. Send enough of them, and a patient enemy with enough analysts, enough intercepted traffic, and enough time can begin to pull the layers apart. Slowly, partially, and never all at once, but enough.
Here is the loop this episode follows to its end. A Navy builds a cipher it believes no enemy can read, and entrusts to it the plans for its greatest operations. The enemy, working in secret, wears the cipher down until it can read enough. Not every message, and not in time for all of them, but enough to know where the next blow is coming. The Navy, meanwhile, begins to notice that the enemy keeps turning up in the right place at the right time, again and again, with a consistency that ordinary chance cannot explain. Officers raise the possibility that the code is compromised, and the Navy talks itself out of believing them. The question that hangs over all of it is the one we will answer at the close. The warnings existed. The pattern was visible to anyone willing to look at it without flinching. So why did the most professional Navy in the Pacific refuse to act on the most dangerous suspicion an organization can have? That the enemy is inside its own communications. What is documented is this. The penetration was real, though partial and delayed. The disasters that followed are on the record. And the refusal to believe, that historians still debate in its exact degree, because part of what we know was reconstructed after the war by men explaining how a catastrophe had been allowed to happen. But the shape of it is clear enough. hardest thing to break was not the code. It was the certainty of the men who trusted it.
So this is the shape of the story. A great navy goes to war, carrying a secret it does not know it has lost. Across the ocean, in quiet rooms full of paper, an enemy's analysts copy its coded radio traffic out of the air and labor over it month after month. They never read it fully. They are always a little behind, decrypting fragments, guessing at the rest, racing the calendar against the next change of the cipher. But they are inside it far enough to matter, far enough to reconstruct from intercepted messages the target and timing of the operation that the fleet's own commanders believe is their best-kept secret. From that single advantage, an entire battle is decided before it is fought. A fleet that should have held every material advantage is led into an ambush it never suspected. 4 carriers, the striking heart of the Navy, are lost in a single day. And it is only the beginning of what reading the enemy's mail will allow. Later, the same advantage will reach up and kill the Navy's most important commander out of the open sky by intercepting the schedule of a single inspection flight. Through all of it run the warnings and the refusal to hear them. This is the story of a code that was broken, a Navy that was told, and the choice made out of it. The war that decided so much was fought without a shot, over the radio, by men who never saw each other. A modern fleet cannot keep silent. To move ships across thousands of miles of ocean, to coordinate carriers and escorts and supply, an enormous volume of radio messages has to flow. Orders, position reports, fuel states, weather, the endless administrative traffic of a navy at sea. Every one of those messages, sent in Cipher, goes out into the air where anyone with a receiver can copy it. The enemy did not have to steal anything. He only had to listen. And the fleet broadcast its secrets to him daily, believing the Cipher kept them safe. On the other side of that silence sat the listeners. Radio intelligence was not a single act of brilliance, but an industry. Banks of receivers tuned across the frequencies, operators copying coded traffic hour after hour, the intercepts flowing back to analysts who did nothing but study the enemy's communications. Long before a single message could be read, those analysts had learned a great deal, simply from the traffic itself. This is the part that surprises people. You can learn a startling amount about a fleet without breaking its code at all. Where the messages come from, how many there are, which stations talk to which, when the volume suddenly rises before an operation. All of it tells a story, even when the contents stay locked. The first weapon against the Navy's secrecy was not decryption. It was attention.
That kind of listening is called traffic analysis, and it is the quiet foundation everything else was built on. Without reading a word, analysts could map the fleet by its radio habits. Each major command had its own call signs, its own patterns of who reported to whom. By tracking which stations were busy, which had gone silent, and which had suddenly appeared, the listeners could follow the shape of the Navy as it moved. A carrier force assembling here, a transport group forming there, the way you might infer a gathering storm from the behavior of birds without seeing the weather front itself. A sudden surge of encrypted traffic from a particular command was a signal in its own right. It meant something was being planned, even if no one yet knew what. So the enemy was reading the Navy's intentions in outline long before he could read its words. And this had a second, crueler effect. It told the analysts where to point their hardest effort. When the traffic pattern suggested a major operation building, they knew which messages mattered most, and they threw everything into breaking those. The Navy, for its part, took precautions it believed were sufficient. Call signs were changed, procedures were tightened. But the fundamental vulnerability remained, because it was not a flaw that could be patched. It was the nature of radio itself. To command a fleet across an ocean, you must speak. And whatever you speak, the enemy can hear.
Underneath the traffic analysis, the slower, harder work went on. The actual breaking of the cipher. This was a labor of attrition, not a single triumphant crack. The analysts attacked the additive layer first, looking for the points where the same stretches of additive had been reused, because reuse is where a system of this kind bleeds. They built up, message by message, a partial picture of the underlying codebook, learning that a certain group meant a certain place, another a certain class of ship, another a date or a time. Recovering the meaning of the most common groups first, and guessing at the rest from context. It was painstaking and incomplete. Long passages of any given message stayed dark, but the skeleton of meaning slowly emerged. It is important to be honest about the limits of this, because the legend tends to overstate it. By most accounts, the Navy's cipher was never read cleanly, never read in full, and never read in time as a matter of routine. The analysts were perpetually behind. A message intercepted today might not be readable for days, or weeks, or at all. And by then, the cipher might be on the verge of its next scheduled change, threatening to throw the whole laborious reconstruction back to the beginning. And yet, partial and delayed as it was enough.
Positioned at the center of the
because in
Pacific,
war,
continues
you do
its
not
vital
need to read
operations
every message.
as supporting
You
units
only need
converge
to read
rapidly.
the right one, in time.
By the spring of 1942, the enemy's radio intelligence had reached a dangerous maturity. It could not read the fleet's mind, but it could read its mail. Some of it, late, imperfectly, and in fragments. Combined with the traffic analysis that mapped the fleet's movements, those fragments could be assembled into informed estimates of what was coming. A code group recovered here, a routing pattern noticed there, a surge of traffic from a carrier command. Separately, each was a scrap. Together, in the hands of analysts who had been studying nothing else for months, they were a forecast. And the Navy had no idea. This is the heart of the danger and the heart of the failure to come. The penetration was invisible from the inside. There was no break-in to discover, no missing document, no captured officer talking. The cipher books were all accounted for. The procedures were being followed. From within the Navy, everything about its communications looked exactly as secure as it had always looked. The enemy was not stealing the secrets. He was deriving them, silently, from the very act of the Navy using its own code. That is the most disturbing kind of compromise there is. The kind that leaves no fingerprints, that announces itself only in the enemy's behavior, in his uncanny habit of being ready. And the Navy was about to give him the largest possible opportunity to show what he could do with what he had stolen. It was about to stake its carriers on a plan it believed was secret. In the early summer of 1942, the Navy launched the operation it intended to be decisive. The plan was ambitious, and on paper, overwhelming. The fleet would strike a small but strategically placed atoll in the Central Pacific, draw out the enemy's surviving carriers to defend it, and destroy them in the open sea. It was meant to finish the work begun at the war's outset, to remove the enemy's carrier force from the board and secure the Central Pacific. The Navy committed its finest ships to it, including the carriers that had ranged across the ocean almost unopposed for half a year. The whole design depended on one thing above all others: surprise. The enemy was supposed to be caught off balance, forced to react to a blow he had not anticipated, lured into a battle on the Navy's terms.
The plan assumed the enemy did not know the target, did not know the timing, and would arrive late and scattered if he arrived at all. Every one of those assumptions was false, and they were false for a single reason. The enemy had been reading the traffic. The very messages that set the operation in motion, the coded signals that named the target, that scheduled the movements, that coordinated the forces, were among the messages his analysts were straining hardest to read. The Navy was about to spring a surprise on an enemy who had read the announcement.
There was, however, a problem on the enemy's side, and the way it was solved has become one of the most famous moments in the history of codebreaking. The analysts could read enough of the traffic to see that a major operation was coming, and they had recovered the code group that the messages used for the target. But they could not be certain what that code group stood for. They believed it was the atoll. Others argued it might be somewhere else entirely. A different objective, hundreds of miles away, in a different direction. The whole defense would hinge on guessing right, and a great deal was riding on a guess. So they set a trap of their own, and it was beautifully simple. The garrison on the atoll was instructed to send out a particular plain message, a report, in a form the enemy could easily intercept, that the island was short of fresh water. The bait was laid in the open, and the listeners waited. And in due course, the enemy's own radio traffic obligingly reported, in the very cipher under attack, that the place designated by the disputed code group was short of fresh water. That settled it. The code group meant the atoll. The target was confirmed, not by breaking the message that mattered, but by tricking the enemy into encrypting a fact the analysts had planted themselves. It is one of the cleverest things anyone did in the entire war, and it cost the Navy 4 carriers. With the target confirmed and the timing estimated, the enemy did the one thing the Navy's plan had assumed he could not do. He got there first. Instead of being lured out late and piecemeal to react to the attack, the enemy's carriers sailed to a position off the atoll and waited, concealed, ready, lying exactly where the incoming fleet did not expect them to be. The ambush the Navy thought it was setting had been turned inside out. The hunters were the hunted, and they did not know it. When the battle opened, the Navy's carriers were caught at the worst possible moment. Their decks crowded as they prepared and rearmed their aircraft, their attention fixed on the atoll and not on the empty sea where the danger actually lay. The enemy's strike fell on them almost out of nowhere. In the span of a few minutes, the course of the Pacific War turned. 4 of the Navy's carriers, the same ships that had dominated the ocean from the opening day, were set ablaze and lost. It would be wrong to say the broken code alone won the battle. Courage, luck, and grievous errors of judgment on both sides all played their part, as they always do. But the foundation, the thing that made everything else possible, was that the enemy knew where to be and when. He knew because he had read enough of the cipher to know. The battle was a fair fight only in the sense that an ambush is a fair fight. After the battle, the most important question was not why the carriers were lost. It was why the enemy had been waiting. To any clear-eyed observer inside the Navy, the result demanded an explanation. The enemy had not stumbled onto the fleet. He had been positioned, in advance, in precisely the right place to ambush an operation whose entire premise was secrecy. He had behaved exactly as he would have behaved if he had known the plan. There were only a few ways that could have happened. A leak, a spy, an extraordinary run of intuition, or the one possibility that was hardest to face, that the cipher had been read.
This was the moment for the Navy to look hard at its own communications. The evidence was not subtle. A surprise attack that surprised no one is the single clearest fingerprint a compromised code can leave. And there were officers in the communications branches who understood exactly what that fingerprint meant and were prepared to say so. But the cost of believing it was enormous. To accept that the cipher had been read was to accept that every secret message sent for months might have been read, that the disaster was self-inflicted, that the Navy's confidence in its own security had been a delusion. It was easier, far easier, to reach for the other explanations. Bad luck, a leak that could be plugged, enemy reconnaissance that happened to be in the right place. The Navy reached for them, and in reaching, it left the door it could not bear to look at standing open.
The warnings did not come as a single dramatic alarm. They came as a pattern, accumulating over months, that any organization willing to see it could have read. It was in the recurring bad luck, the enemy turning up where he should not have been, intercepting movements he should not have known about, concentrating his strength against operations that were supposed to be secret. Once is chance, twice is coincidence, but the pattern repeated in different places, against different commands, with a consistency that a thoughtful officer could not honestly attribute to luck. Something was telling the enemy where to look, and there were men who said so. By most accounts, communications and intelligence officers within the Navy did raise the possibility, more than once, that the operational cipher was compromised, that the enemy's uncanny anticipation pointed to the one cause the Navy least wanted to consider. They were not cranks. They were the very people whose job was to understand the security of the code. And several of them looked at the evidence and reached the correct, terrible conclusion. What is documented, and what historians still debate in its precise extent, is how those warnings were received. The weight of the record suggests they were heard, considered, and then set aside, not acted upon with the urgency the danger deserved. The suspicion was raised. The cipher was not fundamentally overhauled in time, and the gap between those two facts is where the failure lived.
To understand why a competent Navy could ignore so clear a warning, you have to understand the forces arguing against belief. The first was confidence in the cipher itself. The system was genuinely complex, layered and periodically changed, and the men responsible for it believed, sincerely, that it could not be read in any useful way. That belief was not stupid. It was the considered judgment of professionals who knew how hard their own system was to break. But it hardened, over time, into something closer to faith. And faith does not weigh evidence. It explains evidence away. The second was institutional pride. To admit the cipher was broken was to admit a catastrophic failure at the heart of the Navy's own house. Not the enemy's strength, but the Navy's own negligence. Organizations find that kind of admission almost physically difficult. It is far more comfortable to credit the enemy with luck or skill in the field than to accept that you have been handing him your plans. And the third was sheer cost. Changing a fleet's main cipher in the middle of a war is not a simple matter of issuing new keys. It means printing, distributing, and synchronizing new codebooks and additive tables across hundreds of ships and stations, spread over a vast ocean, in secret, without disrupting operations. An enormous, risky logistical undertaking, with a dangerous transition period in which confusion itself could be a vulnerability. Every one of those pressures pushed the same way, toward not believing, toward waiting, toward hoping the suspicion was wrong.
While the Navy hesitated, the enemy's advantage reached up and took its most senior life. In the spring of 1943, the Navy's most important commander undertook an inspection tour of forward positions in the South Pacific. To coordinate the visit. His detailed itinerary, the times, the route, the stops, was sent out by radio, in Cipher, to the units that would receive him. It was exactly the kind of message the enemy's analysts had spent years learning to read. They intercepted it, they decrypted enough of it, and they understood what they were holding: the precise schedule of the single most valuable man in the Navy, laid out for them in his own service's code. The enemy acted on it. A flight of long-range fighters was sent to be in the right patch of sky at the right minute, far out over the water, where no one would expect an interception. They found the commander's aircraft almost exactly where the decoded schedule said it would be. They shot it down. The man who had planned the Navy's greatest operations was killed in the air by an ambush built entirely out of a message his own side had encrypted and believed safe. It is hard to imagine a more direct demonstration that the cipher was compromised. The enemy could not have been there by chance. He was there because he had read the schedule. And still, the full implication was resisted. The suspicion managed rather than confronted. The code not torn up and rebuilt with the speed the evidence screamed for.
Step back, and the shape of the refusal becomes its own kind of tragedy. This was not a navy of fools. It was, by any measure, one of the most professional and capable fighting forces of its age, manned by intelligent and dedicated officers. And that is precisely what makes the failure so instructive. The refusal to believe the cipher was broken did not come from incompetence. It came from the ordinary human machinery that makes any large, proud, successful organization resist its most dangerous truth. The certainty bred by past success, the pride that cannot absorb a self-inflicted wound, the rational-seeming reasons to delay a costly and disruptive fix. Every individual decision not to act could be defended in the moment. The evidence was circumstantial. The alternative explanations were plausible. The cost of overreacting was real. And so, step by reasonable step, the Navy talked itself out of the one conclusion that would have saved it, until the accumulation of those reasonable steps amounted to a decision of historic consequence. The refusal to believe was not a single act. It was 1,000 small permissions to keep believing what was comfortable. That is the deepest lesson buried in this story, and it is not really about codes at all. The hardest thing for a powerful institution to do is to accept that its confidence has become its blindness, that the very strength that won its early victories has made it unable to see the danger at its own center. The Navy could break ciphers. It could not break its own certainty. And the second failure cost more than the first.
The reform of the ciphers did come. It came too late to matter the way it should have. Over the course of the war, the Navy did change and strengthen its codes, sometimes with real effect. And each significant change did, for a time, throw the enemy's analysts back into the dark, forcing them to begin the long labor of reconstruction all over again. The vulnerability was never absolute, and the Navy was never entirely transparent to its enemy. But the changes tended to come after the damage, not before it, as responses to disasters already suffered, rather than as the decisive, preemptive overhaul that the early warnings had called for. The cipher was patched and replaced in pieces, when what the situation had demanded much earlier was to assume the worst and rebuild from the ground up. By the time the most serious reforms took hold, the strategic catastrophes that broken codes had enabled were already history. The carriers lost at the atoll did not come back. The commander killed out of the open sky did not return. The reform, when it arrived, was an act of damage control after the fact, closing the door on losses that had already walked through it. There is a bitter pattern here that goes well beyond this one Navy. The fix was always possible. The information needed to justify it existed early. What was missing was not capability. It was the willingness to believe the warning while there was still time to act on it.
We should be careful here about how much certainty we claim, because this is one of those stories where the record and the legend do not perfectly agree. What is solidly documented is the outcome: the broken traffic, the ambush at the atoll, the interception of the commander's flight, the enemy's repeated and uncanny anticipation. What is partly reconstruction, assembled after the war from the accounts of the officers involved, is the inner story of the warnings. Exactly who suspected what, exactly when, exactly how forcefully they argued, and exactly how their warnings were dismissed. Some of that comes to us through men explaining, in hindsight, a failure they had witnessed or taken part in. And hindsight is never a perfectly clean witness. Historians still debate how much the Navy truly suspected in real time, and how much the picture of a clear warning ignored was sharpened by the knowledge of how it all turned out. So the honest version is this: we know the cipher was penetrated. We know the Navy did not respond with the urgency the danger warranted. And we have strong, if imperfect, testimony that the danger was recognized by some and not believed by those who could have acted. The precise distribution of blame is blurred. The fact of the failure is not. It is enough. You do not need to settle every detail to see the essential thing. The Navy was told and chose in the ways organizations choose not to hear.
Which brings the loop back to where it opened, and to the question we left hanging. Who warned them, and why did the Navy refuse to believe? The answer the record supports is that the warning came from inside, from the Navy's own communications and intelligence officers, the very men whose profession was the security of the code, reading the same pattern of impossible enemy luck that we have traced through this episode, and reaching the only conclusion that fit. And the refusal came not from any single villain, but from the Navy itself, from the collective weight of its confidence, its pride, and its unwillingness to pay the enormous cost of admitting the unbearable thing was true. That is the seed of defeat this story carries. Not a clever enemy alone. The enemy's code-breaking, brilliant as it was, would have mattered far less against a Navy that had taken its own security warnings seriously and rebuilt its cipher in time. The decisive failure was not that the code could be read. Codes can always, eventually, be read. The decisive failure was the refusal to believe it had been. The choice to trust the comfortable explanation over the terrifying correct one. The battle at the atoll was lost before a single plane took off, because the enemy had read the plan. But the war's deeper lesson was lost somewhere quieter, in the rooms where the warning was raised and set down, and not believed.
Return, at the end, to the sentence we started with. Japan lost the most important naval battle of the Pacific War before a single plane took off, because the enemy had already read the plan. And now you can see that the reading of the plan, terrible as it was only the first half of the failure. The second half was the refusal to accept that the plan could be read at all. The certainty that turned a recoverable vulnerability into a string of irrecoverable disasters. The enemy broke the code. The Navy broke faith with the warning. And of those two failures, the second was the one that did not have to happen. There is a hard kind of courage that has nothing to do with battle. The courage to believe bad news about yourself while there is still time to act on it. By most accounts, that was the courage the Navy could not find. It could face any enemy in the open sea. It could not face the suspicion that the enemy was already inside its own messages, reading its mail, waiting in the empty water where its plans had told him to wait. Next on Tora Files,
the admiral who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor while telling his own government that Japan could not win a long war. And he seemed to do it. Subscribe. The Pacific War, told from the other side.